Aristotle, the Politics. Book 1, Chapter 1, The State as an Association. Observations tell us that every state is an association, that every association is formed with a view to some good purpose. I say good because in all actions, all men do in fact aim at what they think is good. Clearly then, as all associations aim at some good, that association which is the most sovereign among them and embraces all others will aim the highest. That is, at the most sovereign of all goods. This is the association which we call the states. Association which is political. He koinona politicae, the association which takes forms of a polis state. It is an error to suppose, as some do, that the roles of a statesman, of a king, of a household manager, and of a master of slaves are the same, on the ground that they differ not in kind, but only in point of numbers or persons. That a master of slaves, for example, has to do with a few people, a household manager with more, a statesman or a king with more still, and if there were no difference between a large household and a small state. They also reckon that when one person is in personal control over the rest, he has the role of a king, whereas when he takes his turn at ruling and being ruled according to the principles of the science concerned, he is a statesman. But these assertions are false. This will be quite evident if we examine the manner according to our established method. We have to analyze other composite things that they can be subdivided no further, because we have reached the smallest parts of the wholes. So to let us in the same way examine the component parts of the state, we shall see. Better how these two differ from one another, and whether we can acquire any systematic knowledge about the several roles mentioned. 1, 2. The state exists by nature. We shall, I think, and this in other subjects, get the best view of the matter if we look at the natural growth of things from the beginning. The first point is that those which are incapable of existing without each other must be united as a pair. Well, for example, the union of the male and female is obviously essential to reproduction. This is not a matter of choice, but it is a matter of natural urge, which exists in the other animals too, and in plants, to propagate one's kind. Equally essential is B, the combination of natural ruler and ruled, for the purpose of preservation. For the element that can use its intelligence to look ahead is by nature ruler and by nature master. While that which has the bodily strength to do the actual work is by nature a slave, one of those who are ruled. Thus, there is a common interest uniting master and slave. Nature then has distinguished between female and slave. She recognizes different functions and lavishly provides different tools, not an all-purpose tool like a Delphic knife. For every instrument will be made best if it serves not many purposes, but one. Evidently, a knife capable of more than one mode of cutting and not perfectly adapted to any one of them is a Delphic knife. Translator. But non-Greeks assign to female and slave exactly the same status. This is because they have nothing which is by nature fitted to rule. Their association consists of a male slave and a female slave. So as the poets say, it is proper that Greeks should rule non-Greeks. The implication that being non-Greek and slave are by nature identical. Thus, it was out of the association formed by men with these two, women and slaves, that a household was first formed. And the poet Hesiod was right when he wrote, "Get first a house and a wife and an ox to draw the plow. For the ox is the poor man's slave." The association of persons established according to the nature for the satisfaction of daily needs is the household, the members of which Chardonus calls breadfellows, and the Epimenides of Cretan stable companions. The next stage is the village. The first association of them are houses for the satisfaction of something more than daily needs. It comes into being through the processes of nature in the fullest sense, as offshoots of a household that are set up by sons and grandsons. This is why states were ruled by kings, as are foreign nations to this day. They were formed from constituents which were themselves under knightly rule. For every household is ruled by its senior member, as by a king. And the offshoots too, because their blood relationship, are ruled in the same way. This kind of rule is mentioned in Homer, which man has power of law over children and wives. He is referring to scattered settlements, which were common in primitive times. For this reason, the gods too are said to be governed by a king. Many men themselves were originally ruled by kings, and some are so still. Just as men imagine gods in human shape, so they imagine all their ways of life can be like that of men. In the final association, formed by several villages, is the state. For all practical purposes, the process is now complete. Self-sufficiency has been achieved, and while the state has come about as a means of securing life itself, it continues to mean to secure the good life. Therefore, every state exists by nature, as earlier associations too were natural. The association is the end of those others, and nature is itself an end. For whatever is the end product of the coming into existence of any object, and that is what we call its nature, of a man, for instance, or horse of a household. Moreover, the aim of the end is perfection, and self-sufficiency is both an end and perfection. It follows that the state belongs to a class of objects which exist by nature, in which man is by nature a political animal. Anyone who is by his nature is not simply by ill luck, has no state, is either too bad or too good, either subhuman or superhuman. He is like the war-mad man, condemned in Homer's words as having no family, no law, no home. For he who is such by nature is mad on war. He's a non-cooperator. He's like an isolated piece in a game of droughts or checkers. But obviously, man is a political animal in the sense in which a bee is not, or any other gregarious animal. Nature, as we say, does nothing without some purpose, and she has endowed man alone, and the animals with the power of speech. For speech is something different from voice, which must be possessed by other animals, and also used by them to express pain and pleasure. For their nature does indeed enable them not only to feel pleasure and pain, but to communicate these feelings to each other. Speech, on the other hand, serves to indicate what is useful and what is harmful, and also what is just and what is unjust. For the real difference between man and other animals is that humans alone have perception of good and evil, just and unjust, etc. It is the sharing of a common view in these matters that makes a household and a state. Furthermore, the state has a natural priority over the household and over any individual among us. For the whole must be prior to the part. Separate a hand or a foot from the body, they will no longer be hand or foot except in name, as one might speak of a hand or foot sculptured in stone. That will be the condition of the spoiled hand, which no longer has the capacity or function which to define it. So although they have the same names, we cannot say that they are in condition the same things. It is clear that the state is both natural and prior to the individual. For if any individual is not fully self-sufficient after separation, he will stand in the same relationship to the whole as the parts in the other case do. Whatever is incapable of participating in the association, which we call the state, the dumb animal, for example, and equally whatever is perfectly self-sufficient and has the need to, e.g. a god, is not part of the state at all. Among all men, there's a natural impulse towards this kind of association, and the first man to construct a state deserves credit for conferring very great benefits. For as man is the best of all animals when he has reached his full development, so he too is the worst when he is divorced from law and from justice. For injustice armed is the hardest to deal with. And though man is born with weapons, he can use them in service of practical wisdom and virtue, it is all too easy for him to use the opposite purposes. Hence, man without virtue is the most savage, the most unrighteous, the worst in regard to sexual license and gluttony. The virtue of justice is a feature of the state. For justice is an arrangement of the political association, and a sense of justice decides what is just. 1.3. The household and its slaves. Now that I explained what component parts of the state are, since every state consists of households, it is essential to begin with the household management. This topic can be subdivided so as to correspond to the parts which complete households is made up, namely the free and the slaves. But our method requires to examine everything when we have reduced to its smallest part. And the first and smallest division of a household into given parts gives three pairs. There's a master and slave, a husband and wife, the father and children. And so we must ask ourselves what each one of these three relationships is and what sort of thing it ought to be. The word mastership is used to describe the first, and we may use matrimonial in the case of the union of man and woman, and paternal to describe the other two, as there is no specific term for either. We may accept these three, but we find that there is a fourth element, which some people regard as covering the whole household management, others that is its most important part, and our task is to consider its position. I refer to what is called the acquisition of wealth. Let us first discuss master and slave in order to see how they bear on the provision of essential services. Whether we can find a better way towards understanding this topic than if we started from the suppositions usually made. For example, some people suppose that being a master requires a certain kind of knowledge, and that this is the same knowledge as is required to manage a household or a statesman or a king, an error which we discussed at the beginning. Others say that it is contrary to nature to rule as a master over slave, because the distinction between slave and free is one of convention only. And in nature, there really is no difference. So the form of rule is based on force and therefore not just. 1.4, the slave is a tool. Now, property is part of household, and the acquisition of property part of household management. For neither life itself nor the good life is possible without a certain minimum supply of necessities. Again, in any special skill, the availability of the proper tools will be essential to the performance of the task, and the household manager must have his likewise. Tools may be animate as well as inanimate. For instance, a ship's captain uses a lifeless rudder, but a living man for watch. For a servant is, from the point of view of his crafts, categorized as one of his tools. So any piece of property can be regarded as a tool enabling a man to live. And his property is an assemblage of such tools. For a slave is a sort of living piece of property, and every other servant is a tool in charge of other tools. For suppose that every tool we have performed its task, either at bidding or itself perceiving the need, and if, like the statues of Daedalus or the tripods of Hephaestus, of which the poet says that self-moved, they enter the assembly of the gods. Shuttles in a loom could fly to and fro and pucker or play a lyre of their own accord. The master craftsman will have no need for servants or masters or slaves. Tools in the ordinary sense are productive tools, whereas a piece of property is meant for action. For I mean, for example, a shuttle produces something other than its own use. A bed for a garment does not. Moreover, since production and action differ kind and in both require tools, the difference between their tools too must be of the same kind. Now, life is action and not production. Therefore, a slave and a servant is one of the tools that minister to action. A piece of property is spoken of in the same way and as a part is. For a part is not only a part of something, but belongs to it to tout court, and it does so, and so too does a piece of property. So a slave is not only his master's slave, but it belongs to him in tout court, while the master is his slave's master, but does not belong to him. These considerations will have shown him what nature and functions of the slave are. Any human being that by nature does not belong to himself, but to another is by nature a slave. And a human being belongs to another whenever, in spite of being a man, he is a piece of property. That is, a tool having a separate existence and meant for action. 1.5, slavery is part of his universal natural pattern. But whether anyone does in fact nature answer to this description, and whether or not it is just and a better thing for one man to be a slave to another, or whether all slavery is contrary to nature, these are questions which must be considered next. Neither theoretical discussion nor empirical observation presents any difficulty. That one should command and another obey is necessary and expedient. Indeed, some things are so divided from birth, some to rule, some to be ruled. There are many different forms of ruler-ruled relationship, and the quality of the rule depends primarily on the quality of the subjects. Rule over man being better than rule over animals. For that which is produced is better men is a piece of work, and the ruler-ruled relationship is itself a product created by the men involved in it. For wherever there is a combination of elements, continuous or discontinuous, and a common unity is the result, in all such cases the ruler-ruled relationship then appears. It appears notably in living creatures as a consequence of their whole nature, and it can exist also where there is no life, as dominance in a musical scale, but there is hardly relevant here. The living creature consists in the first place of mind and body, and of these the former is ruler by nature, and the latter is ruled. Now, we must always look at nature's own norm in things whose condition is according to nature, and not base our observations on degenerate forms. We must therefore, in this connection, consider the man who is in good condition mentally and physically, in one whom the rule of mind over body is conspicuous, because the bad and unnatural condition of a permanently or temporarily depraved person will often give the impression that his body is ruling over his soul. However, as that may be, as I say, within living creatures that we first find it is possible to see both the rule of a master and that of a statesman. The rule of soul over body is like a master's rule, while the rule of intelligence over desire is a statesman or a king's rule. In these relationships, it is clear that it is both natural and experience for the body to be ruled by the soul, and the emotional part of our nature is to be ruled by our mind, in part which possess reason. The reverse, or even parity, will be fatal all around. This is also true between man and other animals, for tame animals are by nature better than wild, and it's better for them all to be ruled by men, because it concerns their safety. Again, as between male and female, the former is by nature superior and ruler, the latter inferior and subject, and this must hold good of mankind in general. Therefore, whenever there is the same wide discrepancy in human beings, as there is in between soul and body, or between man and beast, and those condition is such that their function is the use of their bodies. Therefore, whenever there is the same wide discrepancy between human beings and between soul and body, or between man and beast, there can be those whose condition is such that their function is the use of their bodies, and nothing better than is expected of them. Those, I say, are slaves by nature. It is better for them, just as in the cases mentioned, to be ruled thus. For the slave by nature is he that can and therefore does belong to another, and he that participates in reason, so far as to recognize it, is not so as to possess it, whereas other animals obey not reason but emotions. The use made of slaves hardly differs at all from that of tame animals. They both help with their bodies to supply our essential needs. It is then nature's purpose to make these bodies of free men to differ from those of slaves, the latter strong enough to be used for necessary tasks, and the former erect and useless for that kind of work, but well suited for the life of a citizen of state, a life which is in turn divided between the requirements of war and peace. But the opposite often occurs. For people who have the right kind of bodily physique for free men, but not for the soul, others who have the right soul, but not the body, this much is clear. Suppose there were men who were merely bodily physique, showed the same superiority as shown by the statues of gods. Then all would agree that the rest of mankind would deserve to be their slaves. And this is true in relation to physical superiority. The distinction would even be more just in respect to superiority of soul. But it is much more difficult to see the beauty of soul than the beauty of body. It is clear that by nature some are free, others are slaves, and that for these it is both just and expedient that they should serve as slaves. 1.6. The relation between legal and natural slavery. On the other hand, it is not hard to see that those who take opposing views are also right up to a point. The expressions the state of slavery and slave have a double connotation. There exists also a legal slave and a state of slavery. The law in question is a kind of agreement, which provides that all that is conquered in war is termed the property of the conquerors. Against this right, many of those versed in law bring a charge analogous to that of illegality brought against an orator. They hold it to be indefensible that man who has been overpowered by the violence of a superior might be another should become his property. Others see no harm in this, and both views are held by experts. For it is clear that there is a justification for the difference of opinion, while it is not invariably true that slaves are slaves by nature and others free. Yet this distinction does in some cases prevail. Cases where it is expedient for one to be the master and the other the slave. Whereas the one must be ruled, the other should exercise the rule for which he is fitted by nature, thus being their master. For if the work of a master is badly done, that is contrary to the interest of both parties, for the part and the whole, the soul and the body, have identical interests, and the slave is in a sense part of his master, a living and separate part of his body. For the reason there is an interest in common of a feeling of friendship between master and slave, wherever they are by nature fitted for this relationship, but not when the relationship rises out of the use of force, by which the law, which we have been discussing. Book 2.1, Introduction of Ideal States. We have undertaken to discuss that form of association which is the state, and to ask which all of such associations would be best if we were in a position to live exactly as we would like. So we must look at other constitutions too. For example, those that are in use in states that have a reputation for being governed by good laws, or any others that have been sketched by writers and appear to be good. Our purpose was partly to see what in them is right and useful and what is not. But we also wish to make it clear that if we keep looking for something different from what we might find there, we do not do so out of a desire to be clever. We have embarked on this investigation simply because, in fact, none of these existing constitutions is in fact satisfactory. We must begin at the natural starting point for this inquiry. In a state, either all the citizens share all things, they share or they share none, or they share some but not others. For it is clearly impossible that they should have no share in anything. At the very least, the Constitution being a form of association, they must share in the territory, the single territory of this single state, of which the single state, the citizens are the sharers. The question becomes twofold. If a city is to be run well, is it better if the citizens should share all things capable of being shared, or only in some of them and not in others? It is certainly quite possible for citizens to go shares in with each other, with children, wives, in pieces of property, as in the Republic of Plato. But in that work, Socrates said that children, wives, and even property are to be held in common. We ask, therefore, it is better to do as we do now, or should we adopt the laws proposed in the Republic? 2.2. Extreme unity in Plato's Republic. The proposal that wives should be held in common presents many difficulties, which these three are chief. For A, Socrates' arguments clearly fail to justify the purpose for which he claims such legislation is necessary. B, further, the end which he says the state should have is, in the form described in a dialogue, unworkable. Yet C, it is nowhere laid down in what other sense is to be understood. I'm referring to this assumption made by Socrates that it is best that the whole state should be as much a unity as possible. But obviously, a state which becomes progressively more and more of a unity will cease to be a state at all. Plurality of numbers is natural in a state, and the farther it moves away from plurality towards unity, the less a state becomes and more of a household, and the household in turn an individual. We would all agree that the household is more of a unity than the state, and that the individual than the household. So even if it were possible to make such a unification, it not be done, for it will destroy the state. The state consists not merely of a plurality of men, but of different kinds of men. You cannot make a state out of men who are all alike. Hence, our state in ethics, it's a reciprocal equivalence that keeps a state in being. The principle is essentially even among citizens who are free and equal, for they cannot hold office simultaneously and must do so for a year time or for some other appointed period. This does not, in fact, ensure that all rule, just as if shoemakers and carpenters were to change places with each other instead of always keeping the same kind of work. On this analogy, of course, it is better for those in charge of the political association should, if it is at all possible, not change places with the same people, but always be the same people. But where that is not possible, since they are all by nature equal, and by all the same should all just benefit or burden of ruling than the principles, that equals should yield practice in turn, and B, that out of the office they should all be similar, or at least approximate in that practice. Some rule while others are ruled. And by doing this, it turns out that if they became different persons every time, there is similar differentiation among those ruling, for now they hold one office, now another. It is clear from all this that the state is not an unnatural unity in the sense that some people think, and that what has been alleged to be the greatest good in states, that is unity according to Plato, does in fact make for their dissolution, whereas that which is good of a thing makes for its preservation. And there is another indication that excessive striving for unification is a bad thing in a state. A household is more self-sufficient than the individual, the state than the household, and the moment association becomes to compromise enough people to be self-sufficient, effectively we have a state. Since therefore a greater degree of self-sufficiency is to be preferred than lesser, the lesser degree of unity is to be preferred to the greater. 2.3. Extreme unity is impractical. There is further harm in the doctrine that the greater the number of owners, the less the respect for common property. People are much more careful of their own personal possessions than of those owned communally. They exercise great care over common property only insofar as they are personally affected. Other reasons apart, the thought that someone else is looking after it tends to make them careless of it. This is rather like what happens in domestic service. A greater number of servants sometimes does less work than a smaller. Each citizen requires 1,000 sons, but they are not one man's sons, and any one of them is equally the son of any person. As a result, will be equally neglected by everyone. Moreover, when a man uses my in this way, with reference to a fellow citizen, he is speaking only as a small fraction of a large number. In saying my son or X's son is doing well or not doing well, he is truly referring to each one of 1,000 fathers, or whatever the number of citizens may be, and even then with some dubiety, since it is uncertain whether any particular citizen is in fact the father of a son. And he would rather be a cousin who was really someone's own personal cousin than a son in the manner described. Again, one cannot prevent people from making assumptions about their own brothers, sons, fathers, or mothers, but the likeness which exists between parents and their offspring would invariably be regarded as sure signs of a connection. And this is what actually occurs, according to reports of certain writers of travelers around the world, who tell us that some of the upper peoples of Upper Libya have a community of wives, and they can always tell whose children are whose by their resemblances. 2.4. Further objections to the community of wives and children. Well, here are some further evil consequences which could easily be avoided by those who set up such a form of association. There is assault, homicide, both intentional and unintentional, feuds and slander. All these are unholy if they're committed against the father or mother or in close relatives, just as when they're committed against non-relatives. Yet such things are even more likely to happen when people are not aware of any relationships when they are aware. And when they do happen, those who know the relationship can at least make expiations which religious custom demands, and others cannot. So, taken all around, the results of putting such laws into practice would inevitably be directed towards the results which correct legislation ought to bring about, and moreover to those of Socrates revised as the reason for ordering matters in this way for children and wives. For we believe that the existence of affectionate feelings in states is a very great boon to them. It is a safeguard against faction. And Socrates is emphatic in his praise of unity in state, which, as it seems, and as he himself says, is one of the products of affection. In another of Plato's dialogues, one which treats of love, we read that Aristophanes said that lovers, because of the warmth and affection, are eager to grow into each other and become one instead of two. In event of one of the other must perish, if not both. But in a state in which there exists such a mode of association, the feelings of affection will invariably be watery. Father hardly ever saying, my son, or my son saying, my father. Just as a small amount of sweetening dissolved in a large amount of water does not reveal its presence to the taste, so the feelings of a relationship implies in the terms become nothing. And in such a state like this, there's virtually nothing to oblige fathers to care for their sons, or sons to care for their fathers, or brothers for each other. These are two impulses which more than others cause human beings to cherish and feel affection for each other, like this is my own, or this is my delight. Among people organized this manner, no one would be able to say either. 2.5. The ownership of property. Connected with the foregoing is the question of property. For what arrangements should be made about it if people are not going to operate the best possible constitution? Should it be held in common or not? The question may be considered in the isolation from legislation about children and wives. A possible answer is that it should belong to individuals as a general practice. It would be better that either property or its use should be communal. For if the work done and the benefit accrued are equal, well and good, but if not, there will inevitably be ill-filling between those who get a good income without doing much work and those who work harder and get no corresponding extra benefit. To live together and to share in any human concern is hard enough to achieve at the best of times, and such a state of affairs makes it doubly hard. The same kind of trouble is evident when a number of people in a club together for the purpose of travel. How often have we not seen such partnerships break down over quarrels arising out of trivial and unimportant matters? In the household also, we get most annoyed with those servants with whom we employ to perform ordinary routine tasks. These, then, are some of the difficulties inherent in the common ownership of property. Far better is the present system, provided that it has an added attraction of being a matter of habit and out of being controlled by sound laws. If so, it will have the advantage of both systems, both the communal and the private. For while property should up in point be held in common, the general principle should be that of private ownership. Responsibility for looking after property, if distributed over many individuals, will not lead to mutual recriminations. On the contrary, with every man busy with his own, there will be increased effort all around, for all things in common among friends, as the saying goes, and the personal virtue of individuals that ensure their common use. And such an arrangement is by no means impossible, for it exists, if only in an outline, in some states already, and in well-run ones particularly, when to a certain degree is an actual operation could be extended. For each man has his own possessions, part of which he makes available for his friends' use, part which he uses in common with others. For example, in Sparta, they used each other's slaves practically, if they were their own. And dogs and horses too. And if they need food on a journey, well, they get it in the country as they go. Clearly, it is better for property to remain in private hands, but we should make use of it communal. It is a particular duty of a lawgiver to see that citizens are disposed to do this. Moreover, there is an immense amount of pleasure to be derived in the sense of private ownership. It is surely no accident that every man has affection for himself. Nature meant this to be so. Selfishness is condemned, and justly, but selfishness is not simply to be fond of oneself, but to be excessively fond. So excessive fondness for money is condemned. Though nearly every man is fond of that kind of everything of that kind. And further point is that there is a very great pleasure in helping and doing favors to friends and strangers and associates. And this happens when people have property of their own. None. These advantages are secured without those who seek excessive unification of the state. And what is more, they are openly throwing away practice of two virtues, self-restraint with regard to women, for it is a fine practice to keep off one another's wife through restraint, and liberality with regard to property. The abolition of private property will mean that no man will be seen to be liberal, and no man will ever do any act of liberality, for it is use of articles of property where liberality is practiced. We must not forget another point that is to be considered, simply the immense period of time in which this formal organization has remained and undiscovered, and surely it would not have remained if it were really good. Pretty well for all the possible forms of organization we have been discovered, there's no complete collection of them which has been made, and many are known and not practiced. But the force of our arguments will become clearer if we were to see such a constitution be put together into practice. But what of the arrangements of the constitution as a whole? And how do they affect participant members? In the absence of any possible positive statement by Socrates, it's very hard to say, but certainly the bulk of other citizens will make up the entire population of the state. But no decision was taken as to whether the farming class are supposed to have communal or private possession, or whether property of wives or children. Suppose that they too are to have all these in common, then we'll be able to distinguish them from the guardians. And what good will it come for them to submit to their rule? Or what inducement will there be to accept it? Or if, on the other hand, we assume that they arrange things exactly as in all the other states, well, how will they associate at all? The inevitable result will be two states within one, and these in some degree in opposition to each other. For on the one side he puts the guardians, like a garrison, and on the other side the farmers, the craftsmen, and all of the rest as citizens. This can only lead to disputes and litigation and all other things evil that he speaks of arising in other states. And yet Socrates says that, thanks to education, there will be no need for large numbers of regulations such as those governing the wardenship of the city and market and the like, and this while giving that education only to the guardians. In any case, No final decision was reached as to whether there was the same necessity for such arrangements, nor yet about closely related questions such as the type of constitution they will live under and the nature of their education and laws. This is not easy to discover, and yet the quality of these people will make all the difference to the maintenance as association of the guardians. But if he means to make wives shared and property privately owned, who will look after the house as men tend to the fields? And what if both the wives and the property of the farmers are held in common? To argue from an analogy with wild animals and say that male and female ought to engage in the same occupations is futile. Animals have no household management to do. These are some, but by no means the most serious of the drawbacks inherent in the kind of constitution described by Socrates. Book 3:1. How should we define citizen? Well, in considering how the varieties and characteristics of constitutions, we must begin by looking at the state and asking what it is. There is unanimity in this. For example, by some say that the action was taken by the state, and others that it was not taken by the state, but that the oligarchy or by a dictator. Now, obviously, the activities of statesmen and legislators are wholly concerned with the state, and the Constitution is a kind of organization of that state's inhabitants. But like any other whole, it is made up of many parts, and the state is to be classified as a composite thing. So clearly, we must first try to isolate the citizen, for the state is an aggregate of citizens. So we must ask, who is a citizen, and whom should we call one? Here, too, there is no unanimity, for no agreement on as to what constitutes a citizen. It often happens that one who is a citizen in a democracy is not a citizen in an oligarchy. I think that we may leave out the account for those who merely require the title indirectly, e.g. the made citizens. Nor does the residence in a place confer citizenship, for resident foreigners and slaves are not citizens, but do share domicile in the country. Another definition is those who have access to legal processes or may prosecute or be prosecuted. But this access is open to any persons who are covered by a commercial treaty. At any rate, partially open, for a resident foreigner is in many places obliged to appoint a patron, so that not even this degree of participation is open to him unqualifiedly. Likewise, boys not yet old enough to be enrolled and old people who have retired from duty must be termed citizens in a sense, but only with the addition of not fully or superannuated or some such term. Not that it matters of the word we use, since what we mean is dear enough. What we are looking for is the citizen proper, without any defect needing to be amended. Similar difficulties may be raised and solved about persons exiled or with civic disqualifications. What effectively distinguishes the citizen proper from all other citizens in his participation in giving judgment and holding office. Some offices are distinguished in respect to length of tenure, some not being tenable for the same person twice under any circumstances, only an interval of time. Others, such membership of a jury or of an assembly or some such limitation. It might be objected that such persons are not really officials, and that these functions do not amount to participation in office, but they have the fullest sovereign power, and it would be ridiculous to deny their participation in office. In any case, nomenclature ought not to make any difference. It is just that there is no name covering which is both common to a juryman and to a member of the assembly, which ought to be used for both. For the sake of definition, I suggest that we say limited office, unlimited office. We therefore define citizens as those who can participate in this. Such a definition seems to cover, as clearly may be, those who would term the citizen is in fact implied. On the other hand, we may see various constitutions differing from each other in kind. A citizen, therefore, will necessarily vary according to the constitution in each case. For this reason, our definition of citizen is best applied in a democracy. In the other constitutions, it may be applicable, but it need not necessarily be so. For in some constitutions, there is no body compromising the people, nor recognized assembly, but only an occasional rally, and justice may be administered piecemeal. For example, at Sparta, contract cases are tried by the ephors, one or other of them, cases of homicide by the elders, and other cases doubtless by other officials. Similarly, at Carthage, all cases are tried by officials. But our own definition of a citizen can be amended to as to apply to other constitutions also. We simply retrace our unlimited office of juror or member of assembly by limited. For it is to all or some that the task of judging or deliberating is assigned, either on all matters or on some. From these considerations, it has been clear who a citizen is. As soon as a man becomes entitled to participate in office, deliberative or judicial, we deem him to be a citizen of that state, and a number of such persons large enough to secure self-sufficient life, we may, by and large, call a state. 3.6. Correct and deviated constitutions. Having settled on these questions, we must proceed to our next task as to whether we are posit only one constitution or more than one. And if more than one, that they are and how many, and what differences are in between them. The constitution of a state is the organization of the offices, and in particular, one that is sovereign over all the others. Now, in every case, the citizen body of a state is sovereign. The citizen body is the constitution. Thus, in democracies, the people are sovereign. In oligarchies, the few. That, we say, is what makes one constitution differ from another. And the same criterion can be applied to others also. But let's return to authority. It is not difficult to distinguish the recognized styles. I often speak about the definition in my public lectures. First, although the natural slave and the natural master really have the same interests, rule of master over slave is exercised primarily for the benefit of the master, and only incidentally for the benefit of the slave, because if the slave deteriorates, the master's rule over him is invariably impaired. Well then, there is the authority of a man over his wife, his children, and his whole household, to which we give the name the household management. This is exercised either for the benefit of those subject to the authority or some common benefit to both parties. In itself, it is the benefit of the subjects, as we see by the analogy of the other skills, such as that of the doctor or of an athlete's trainer, who would only incidentally be concerned with their own interests. For, of course, there is nothing to prevent a trainer on occasion from being himself a member of the team in training, as the man who steers the ship is always one of the members of the ship's company. The trainer or pilot looks to the good of those under his authority, but when he himself is one of them, he gets the same benefit of it incidentally as they do, in that the pilot is a member of the ship's company and the trainer becomes one of those in training while yet remaining their trainer. This is why, whenever authority in the state is constituted on a basis of equality and similarity between citizens, they expect to take turns in exercising it. The principle is a very old, but in earlier times was applied to natural and improper manner. Men expect to each take a turn at public service, and during tenure of office, to look after the interests of someone else, who then did the same for him. But nowadays, there is more to be gained out of public affairs and offices, so men want to be in office continuously. They could hardly be more zealous in their place hunting if they were ill, and their recovery depended on securing office. It is dear, then, that those constitutions which aim at common good are right, as being in accord with absolute justice, while those which aim only at the good of the rulers are wrong. They are all deviations from the right constitutions. They are like the rule of master over slave, whereas the state is an association of freemen. 3.7. Classification of correct and deviated constitutions. Having drawn these distinctions, we must next consider what constitutions there are and how many. We begin with those that are correct, since when these have been defined, it will be easy to see the deviations. As we have seen, constitution and citizen body mean the same thing, and the citizen body is the sovereign power in states. Sovereignty necessarily resides in either one man or in few or in the many. Whenever the one, the few, or the many rule to view the common good, these constitutions must be correct. But if they look to the private advantage, be it of one or a few of the mass, they are deviations. For either we must say those who do not participate are not citizens, or that they must share in the benefit. The usual names for right constitutions are as follows. A, it is a monarchy aiming at a common interest, a kingship. B, a rule of one man, but only a few, such as an aristocracy, so-called because only the best men rule, or because it aims at what is best for the state and all its members. C, political control exercised by the mass of populace in the common interest and polity. This is the name common to all constitutions. It is reasonable to use this term because while it is possible for a man or few outstanding point in virtue, with the conspicuous exception of military virtue, which is found in a great many people, and is why Constitution, the defensive element, is the most sovereign body. And those who share in the Constitution are those who bear arms. The corresponding deviations are: from kinship, we get tyranny; from aristocracy, we then get oligarchy; and from polity, we get democracy. For tyranny is monarchy for the benefit of the monarch, oligarchy for the benefit of only the men of means. Democracy is for the benefit of men without the means. None of the three aims to be at profit for the common interest, to the common interest. 3.9, the distribution of political power. First, we must grasp what definitions of oligarchy and democracy men put forward, and in particular, what is the oligarchic and what is the democratic view of justice. For all adhere to a justice of some kind, but they do not proceed beyond a certain point, and are not referring to the whole of justice in a sovereign sense when they speak of it. Thus, it is thought that justice is equality. And so it is, but not for all persons, only for those that are equal. Inequality is also thought of to be just, and so it is, but not for all, only for the unequal. We make bad mistakes if we neglect this for whom we're deciding what is just. The reason is that we are making judgments about ourselves, and people are generally bad judges where their own interests are involved. So, as justice is relative to people and applies in the same ratio to things and to the persons, as pointed out in my ethics, these disputants, while agreeing to the equality of the thing, then disagree about the persons for whom, and this chiefly for the reason already stated, that they are judging their own case, and therefore badly. There is also further reason, namely that both parties are talking about justice in a limited sense, and so imagine themselves to be talking about justice unqualifiedly. Thus, it is an error when men unequal in one respect, for example, money, suppose themselves unequal in all, just as an error for men equal in one respect, for example, being free, suppose themselves equal in every respect. To argue thus is to neglect the decisive point. If persons originally come together and form an association for the sake of property, then they share in the state in proportion to their ownership of property. This is the apparent strength of the oligarch's view, that is not just out of a sum of 100 minae, that he that contributed that should only receive equal shares with him who found the remaining 99, or that this applies equally to the original sum and any profit subsequently made. But a state's purpose is not merely to provide a living, but to make life that is good. Otherwise, it might be made up of slaves or animals other than man. And that is impossible because slaves and animals do not participate in happiness, nor in a life that involves choice. Footnote: happiness is a customary but inadequate translation of eudaimonia, the state of well-being which consists of living in the exercise of all, especially the highest, that is, the rational and ethical faculties of man. Translator. A state's purpose is also to provide something more than a military pact of protection against injustice, or to facilitate mutual acquaintance and exchange of goods, for the case the Tyrians and the Carthaginians and all others with commercial treaties with one another would be taken as citizens of a single state. Certainly they have their import agreements and they have their treaties to prevent injustice, and when written documents governing their military service. But in the first place, each has its separate officials. There are none in common which they're both equally subject for these purposes. Second, neither side is concerned with equality of the others, or with preventing behavior of any person covered by the agreements from being unjust or wicked, but only with the prevention of injustice between each other. But all who are anxious to ensure government under good laws make their business to have an eye in virtue and vice of the citizens. It thus becomes evident that that which is genuinely and not just nominally called a state must concert itself with virtue. Otherwise, the association is a mere military alliance, differing only in location and restricted territorial extent from an alliance whose parties are at a distance from each other, and under such conditions, law become a mere agreement, or as a Lycophon in the Sophists put it, a mutual guarantor of justice, but quite unable to make citizens good and just. That this is true will be clear from further illustrations. Suppose you merge the territories into one, making the walls of Corinth and Megara contiguous. That still does not make a single state of them, nor would it even if they establish rights of marriage between the two, though this is one of the ties particularly characteristic of states. Or again, suppose you had 10,000 people living apart from each other, but near enough not to become disassociated. Carpenter, farmer, shoemaker, and such like are there. And furthermore, they have laws prohibiting injustice in their transactions with each other. Yet, so long as their association does not go beyond such things as commercial exchange and military alliance, that is still not a state. And why not, you may ask? Well, the reason is certainly not that the association is loosely knit. For even if they actually moved those together and maintained an association which I've described, with each man still treating his own household like a state, and if they mutually supported each other as in a defensive alliance or against injustice only, even then, they would not be considered a state, not at any rate in a strict sense, since the nature of their intercourse is the same, moreover, whether they stay close together or they stay apart. It is clear, therefore, that a state is not an association of people dwelling in the same place, established to prevent its members from committing injustice against each other, and to promote transactions. Certainly, all these features must be present if there is to be a state. Even the presence of every woman in a state ipso facto. Excuse me, I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. So continuing now with page 13. They move together or stay close apart. So two different states, so they might have some alliances for self-defense or for added commerce. It is clear, therefore, that the state is not an association of people dwelling in the same place established to prevent its members from committing injustice against each other and to promote transactions. Clearly, all these features must be present to be a state, but even the presence of one of them does not make them a state ipso facto. The state is an association intended to enable its members and their households and kinship to live well. Its purpose is a perfect and self-sufficient life. However, this will not be attained unless they occupy one and the same territory and intermarry. It is indeed on that account that we find that in states connections between relatives by marriage, brotherhood, sacrifices to gods, and various civilized pursuits of life live together. All these activities are the product of affection, and it's for our affection for others that causes us to choose to live together. Thus, they all contribute towards the good life, which is the purpose of a good state. And the state is an association of kinships and villages, which aims at a perfect and self-sufficient life. And that, we hold, means living happily and nobly. So we must lay it down that the association which is a state exists not only for the purpose of living together, for the sake of noble actions. Those who contribute most to this kind of association are entitled to a larger state than those who may be equal or superior in free birth and by family, and inferior in the virtue that belongs to a citizen. Similarly, they're entitled to a larger share than those who are superior in riches but inferior in virtue. All this makes it clear that those who dispute about the constitutions are using the term justice in a limited sense. 310. Justice and sovereignty. Another question is, where ought the sovereign power of the state to reside? With the mass of the people, with the rich, with the respectable, with one man, with the best of all, or a tyrant? There are objections to all these. But suppose the poor use their numerical superiority to make a distribution of property of the rich. Is that not unjust? No, by Zeus, it may be said, but it has been done justly by decision of the sovereign power. But what else can we call the very height of injustice? And if the majority, having laid their hands on everything, again distribute the possessions of the few, they're obviously then destroying the state. But virtue does not destroy its possessor, nor the justice the destructive of the state. So it is clear, too, that this law, too, cannot be just. Or secondly, if it is just, any actions taken by a tyrant also must be just. His superior strength enables him to use force, just as the mass of people use force on the rich. Thirdly, it is just for the few and the wealthy to rule? If so, and they too did this to plunder and help themselves to the goods of the mass, then that is just. And if that is so, then it is just in the former case also. The answer clearly is that the three states of affairs are bad and not just. However, the fourth alternative, that the respectful should rule and have sovereign power over everything, means that the rest would be without any esteem, being debarred from the honors of holding office under the Constitution. For offices, we say, are honors. And if the same persons hold office all the time, the rest will be without honor. Then is this and the fifth alternative better, that one man, the most worthy, should rule? But this is yet more oligarchical, because it leaves still larger numbers without honor. It might be objected, and that is a bad thing for any human being, subject to the affections that enter the soul, to have sovereign power, which ought to be reserved for the law. But that will not make any difference to the problem cases we have been discussing. There may be a law, but it may have bias towards oligarchy or democracy, so that exactly the same results will ensue. 311, the wisdom of collective judgments. The other possibilities are to be discussed elsewhere. At the moment, it would seem rather that one put one's best foot forward, namely that the mass of people ought to be sovereign rather than the best but few, is not without difficulty, but perhaps has some truth in it. For it is possible that the many, whom take a single without a sand mound, may yet taken altogether, but better for the few, not individually but collectively, in the same way that a feast to which all contribute is better than one supplied at one man's expense. For even where there are many people, each has some share of virtue and practical wisdom, and when they're brought together, just as the mass, they're brought together with one man, with many pairs of feet and hands and many senses. So also they become one man in regard to character and intelligence. That is why the many are better judges of works of music and poetry, and some judge parts, others, but other collective pronouncement of the verdict upon all the parts. And it is this that gives the sound men their superiority over any individual from the masses. Handsome men differ from the ugly, it is said, and paintings from actual objects, because they draw together what is previously scattered here and there. Though any one of the features taken separately, the eye of one man, some part of another, might well be more handsome than in the picture. But it is not all certain that the superiority of the many over the sound few is possible in the case of every people in every large number. There are some by heaven among whom it will be possible. Otherwise, the theory would apply to wild animals, and yet some men are hardly any better than wild animals. But it is no reason why we give the case large number of the truth of the point we've made. These considerations enabled us to solve the farmer problem. And another and related question, and what spheres in the sovereignty of the freemen and the mass of the citizens to be exercised? We must remember that they are not the men of wealth. They have no claim to virtue or anything. Let them share in the highest offices is take a risk, inevitably. Their unjust standards will cause them to commit injustice, and their lack of judgment will lead them into error. On the other hand, there is the risk of not giving them a share, and in their non-participation, for when there are many who have no property and no honors, and they invariably constitute a huge hostile element in the state, but it can remain open to them to participate in deliberating and judging. It was for this reason that both Solon and some of the other lawgivers give to the people right individually to hold such offices. This was on the principle that the whole body acting together has a necessary perception, even though each is individually only partially qualified to judge. Thus, in mixing with the better sort, they render good service in their states, in something like the combination of coarse foods, which renders the whole diet more nutritious than a small amount of the latter. But such an arrangement of the constitution raises a number of difficulties. For first, the proper person to judge whether a piece of medical work has been properly done is the same sort of person as is actually engaged in such a work, on curing the patient of his present sickness. In other words, the medical practitioner himself. And this is equally true of the other skills and empirical crafts. As then among doctors, that a doctor should give an account of himself, so also should other professional men among their peers. By doctor, I mean not only the ordinary practitioner and master craftsman, but also those who have been trained in the art, such as are pretty well in all skills. And we will let these trained persons judge no less than we let the experts. Secondly, in the matter of elections, it would all seem to apply. Choosing a right is the task of the experts. Those in surveying choose the surveyors. Those in navigation choose the navigators. Admittedly, some jobs and some skills, you'd find the laymen who share in the choice, but not more than the experts. So it would seem that on this argument, the mass of the people should not be given the sovereign power either of choosing officials or calling them to account. Perhaps, however, not all the arguments are right. First, there is an argument which we used a while back, thus provided the mass of the people is not too slave-like. Each individual will indeed be a worse judge than the experts, but collectively they will be better, or at any rate no worse. Secondly, there are tasks which the actual doer will be neither the best nor the only judge, cases in which even those who do not possess the skill form an opinion on the finished product. An obvious example is a house building. The builder can certainly form an opinion on the house, but the user, the household manager, will be an even better judge. So too, the user of the rudder, the helmsman, is a better judge of it than the carpenters who made it. And it is the diner and not the cook who pronounces the merits of a dinner. I think it's perhaps these two arguments that are sufficient to resolve this question. But there's another and connected difficulty. It seems odd that inferior persons should have sovereign control over more important matters than the respectable sort. Yet the choice of officials and the scrutiny of their work is a very important matter indeed. But, as we have said, in some constitutions they are assigned to the people, having assembly and having sovereign control over all such matters. Although members of the assembly and also of the council and of the panels of the jurymen are recruited to low property qualifications that are of any age, nevertheless for tertiary officials, generals, and the supreme offices of high property qualification is demanded. This difficulty can be met, and this practice perhaps justified by arguments similar to those we just used. It is not just the individual juryman, counselor, or member of assembly who rules, but the court, the council, and the people. And each of these individual mentioned, meaning the counciliar, assembly member, and juryman, is a part. So it is quite just that the mass of the people should be in sovereign control of more important things, since people, council, and law court contrive many persons. And as for property qualifications, the sum total of property owned by them is larger than those who singly or with a few colleagues hold the highest offices. These matters may be regarded as settled in that way, but we must look back at our original problem, from which nothing emerges so clearly as the fact that the laws, if rightly established, ought to be sovereign, and that officials, whether individually or as a body, ought to have sovereign power to act over various matters about which the laws cannot possibly give a detailed guidance, for it is never easy to frame general regulations covering every particular. We said laws rightly established, but we have not yet discovered what sort of laws these ought to be. So the old problem remains. As constitutions vary, simultaneously and in like manner, the laws too inevitably vary, and are sound or bad, just or unjust. But this is much clearer. The Constitution must set the pattern for the laws. If, however, that is so, laws framed in accordance with one of the right types of constitution will inevitably be just, if in according to one of the deviations, unjust. For 11, the merits of a middle constitution. What is the best constitution? What is the best life for the majority of states and majority of men? Well, we have in mind Men whose virtue does not rise above that of ordinary people and whose education does not depend on the luck of either natural ability or their resources, and who have not an ideally perfect constitution, but first, a way of living in which as many as possible can join, and second, a constitution within the compass of the greatest number of states, the aristocracies, as they're so called, and that we are just as discussing in detail and do not fall within the competence of most states, but some of them do approximate closely what we call polity. Hence, we both speak one of the Constitution, though they were one and the same. The decision on all these points rests on the same set of fundamental principles. If we were right when we were in ethics, we stated that virtue is a mean, and that a happy life is a life without hindrance and its accordance with virtue. Then the best life must be the middle life, consisting in a mean which is open to men of every kind to attain. And it is the same principles must be applicable to the virtue or badness of constitutions and states. For the constitution of a state is in a sense the way it lives. In all states, there are three state sections, the very well off, the very badly off, and thirdly, those that are in between. Since therefore it is agreed that moderation and a middle position are best, it is clear that in the matter of goods, of fortune also, to own a middling amount is best of all. This condition is most easily obedient to reason, and following reason is just what is difficult both for the exceedingly rich, handsome, strong, and well-born, and their opposites, the extremely poor, the weak, and those grossly deprived of honor. The former incline more to arrogance and crime on a large scale, and the latter are more averagely prone to wicked ways and petty crime. The unjust deeds of the one class are due to arrogant spirit, yet the unjust deeds of the other class are then due to wickedness. Add to the fact that it is among the members of the middle section that you find least reluctance to hold office as well as least eagerness to do so, and both these attitudes, both eagerness and reluctance, will be detrimental to states. There are other drawbacks to the two extremes. Those who have a superabundance of good fortune, strength, riches, friends, and so forth, neither wish to submit to any rule nor understand how to do so. And this is ingrained in them from childhood at home. Even at school, they are so full of la dolce vita, the good life, that they have never grown to be used to being ruled. Those, on the other hand, who are greatly deficient in the qualities are too subservient. So they don't know how to rule, but they know how to be ruled as a slave is. While others who do not know how to be ruled in any way at all and can command only like a master ruling over slaves. The result is a state not of free men, but of slaves and masters. The former full of envy and the latter full of contempt. Nothing could be farther removed from the friendship from partnership in a state. Sharing is a token of friendship. One does not want to share even a journey with one's enemies. The state aims to consist as far as possible those who are like and equal, a condition found chiefly among the middle people, and is the best run constitution is certainly to be found in this state, whose composition is, we maintain, the natural one for a state to have. It is the middle citizens in the state who are the most secure. They neither covet the possessions of the others, like the poor, nor do others covet others, such as the poor covet those of the rich. So they live without risk, not scheming and not being schemed against. Phocylides' prayer was that justified when he wrote, "Those in the middle have many advantages. That is where I wish to be in the state." It is clear then that both the best partnership in the state is one which operates through the middle people. And although those states in which the middle element is large and stronger if possible than the other two together, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance in having a well-run constitution. For the addition of its weight to either side will turn the balance and prevent excess at the opposing extremes. For this reason, it is a most happy state of affairs when those who take part in the Constitution have a middling, adequate amount of property, since there's the one set of people who possess a great deal and the other nothing. The result is either extreme democracy or unmixed oligarchy, or a tyranny due to the excess of either. For tyranny often emerges from over an enthusiastic democracy or from oligarchy, but much more rarely from the intermediate constitutions or from those close to them. The reason for this we will speak of later when we deal with changes in constitutions. The superiority of the middle constitution is also clear from the fact that it alone is free from factions. Where the middle element is large, there least of all arise factions and divisions among the citizens, and big states are freer from faction, for this same reason, namely that their middle element is large. In small states, it is easy for the whole body of citizens to become divided into two, which leaves no middle at all. And nearly everybody, either rich or poor. Democracies are safer than oligarchies in this respect, and longer lasting, thanks to the middle people, were more numerous and take a larger share of honors in democracies than in oligarchies. For when their absence in unpropertied preponderance in numbers, trouble arises and they soon come to grief. An indication of the truth that we've been saying is found in the fact that the best lawgivers will come from the middle citizens. Solon, for example, whose middle position revealed in his poems, and Lycurgus, who is not a king, and Charadonus, and most of the rest. These facts do show why most states are either democratic or oligarchic. For the middle being frequently too small, whichever extremes is on top, those with possessions or the common people, it will abandon the middle and conduct a constitution according to its own notions, so that the result is either a democracy or an oligarchy. Then again, owing to constant strife and faction between the people and the wealthy, neither side, whichever of the two succeeds in gaining their mastery, ever sets up a constitution which is equally based and acceptable all around. Taking supremacy in the constitution as a prize of victory, they proceed to set up democracy or an oligarchy, as the case may be. Also, those who come to exercise leadership among the Greek states installed democracies or oligarchies in them, according to the constitution which they each had at home, looking entirely to their own advantage, not to that of the states themselves. So for these reasons, the middle constitution has never occurred anywhere, or only in seldom sporadically. Only one in a long succession of leaders was prevailed upon to allow a system of this kind. And to this day, into whatever state you go, you will find that they have got to the habit of not even wanting equality. Their aim is to rule, failing which they accept a condition of defeat.